All right, everyone, welcome to the 10:30 session. Just a couple reminders again, make sure you've registered for each session that you want to attend. Look for your certificates of attendance about an hour after each presentation is ended. And yeah, if you're looking for a copy of these presentations, as they get done, I upload them to our YouTube page, which is Eastern Oregon EMS Conference. So that being said, so the next presenter, Dr. Beldowitz, is going to present to us this morning on some ballistics and some trauma. So Doc, I will hand it over to you and let you take her away.
All right, thanks. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I started my own medical career in the roles many of you fill today in our healthcare system. I was a volunteer EMT on an EMS service in Rutherford, New Jersey, and then as a technician in an emergency room in Bayonne, New Jersey, before joining the military and subsequently going to medical school. So I just want to say to all of you, thank you for having what I can only really describe as the tenacity to continue to do what you do. I'm not sure I'd be in the position I am today if I had to deal with all you guys I've had to deal with these last few years. So really, the rest of us appreciate everything you guys do on the front line. So my talk today is going to focus on gunshot wounds because in my mind, this is a high stakes area of medicine where you and I often interact. Please understand from the start, this is not a political discussion, but it is to me a personal one. I'm a 17-year veteran of our armed forces. I am a gun owner, but I'm also a physician that's often confronted with the outcomes of people's interactions with firearms. So whether intentional or accidental, self-inflicted or directed from others. I've relied on weapons to defend my life in harsh environments, but I've also been helpless to control the damage they can inflict. And so my hope today is that we can kind of develop a better understanding and a common understanding of what happens when bullets hit their targets. Much has been made in the media kind of about the explosion of gun violence over the course of the COVID pandemic. And though the reason for this is multifactorial, statistics suggest that gun violence has itself become its own pandemic within the larger pandemic, at least within the United States. Last year, there were 44,857 deaths related to gun violence in America. That's a 2.8% increase from the year prior, the first year of the full year of the pandemic. But that itself had been a 10% increase from the previous year. Suicides make up roughly 55% of gun deaths in the past year, but the total number of deaths inflicted by a shooter upon another is still more than 20,000 per year. Portland is the city that I call home, and it's where I work, and it's not immune to this health crisis. It's sort of interesting to note that as far as most cities go, Portland's response to the COVID-19 pandemic has actually been relatively exemplary from an infectious disease standpoint. Portland's enjoyed lower case rates and lower fatality rates than many other municipalities, but there's clearly something about this pandemic or its response that has led to an increased dependence on gun violence to solve problems. The data depicted here are for all reported shooting incidents from 2019 through 2021, and you can see a marked increase in gun violence following May 2020, when COVID-19 became a dominant force in our lives. Since then, even periods of relatively relaxed restrictions have seen persistently heightened incidences of gun violence. And kind of my concern for my city is that we may have unfortunately established a new baseline of gun utilization that may end up becoming the new normal. This data depicts those incidents that actually resulted in injury. So these numbers here are representative of our patients. This is where you and I interact. And collectively, I feel like it's our job to ensure that as few people as possible migrate from this slide to that first slide I show you that illustrated the death toll of gun-related violence in America. So we'll start with a simple definition of ballistics, which is the science of projectiles, specifically how masses behave while they're passing through air. So an understanding of this, I think, kind of can help us understand sort of the wounding patterns and mechanisms of injury we see when bullets strike their targets. So there are various disciplines of ballistics that can be organized chronologically so that we can establish an understanding of a bullet's construction and design and how it interacts with a gun, so that we can then understand how it behaves when it travels through air. I have no doubt that there's probably some people in this audience who are more knowledgeable on the study of internal ballistics than I am. There may be some who are more knowledgeable on external ballistics, but I've been a surgeon in the military for nearly 18 years, and it's my main intention to share with you my knowledge and experience of terminal ballistics so that you all may gain some insight to what exactly occurs when this meticulously designed, mass-produced object interacts with a living, breathing target, whether that target is intended or unintended. So if you're a gun owner, a hunter, or a recreational shooter, these next few slides may seem a bit elementary, but I think it's important for all of us to have a shared vocabulary, at least rudimentary understanding of the components and mechanisms of firearms and ballistics. This is admittedly an area that I, growing up in an urban and suburban environment, didn't really have a good understanding of, even after many years in the military and in healthcare. I found it is often overlooked as unimportant. I've had plenty of trauma surgeons say, oh, it doesn't matter, I just treat the wound. But as my career has progressed, really both in the military and in trauma surgery, I have found my interaction with bullets increasing with frequency and consistently becoming more consequential. So this illustration depicts the principal components of an ammunition cartridge. Basically, when a primer is struck, it ignites a propellant, which thrusts a bullet forward from the tip of the casing, where it accelerates as it passes through the gun barrel and out the muzzle. What is depicted here is specifically what is loaded into a gun's chamber, but not all of it will end up coming out of the gun's muzzle. Some portions will have combusted into a cloud of gas, dust, heat, and pressure. Others will be ejected from the top or the side of the weapon, and a relatively small component will actually be thrust forward, often at supersonic speed. So the construction of the primer is such that it contains a highly volatile chemicals that react when compressed. So when the primer is struck by a hammer or the strike plate of a gun, it causes a near instantaneous ignition of the igniter compound. The heat is then projected forward by the shape and construction of the primer so that it in turn ignites the propellant, or what we often refer to as gunpowder. Traditional gunpowder is kind of described in this illustration, but it's hardly used anymore due to its inefficiency at propelling bullets relative to newer alternatives. More commonly, they use something called smokeless powder, which consists primarily of nitrocellulose, nitroglycerin, and nitroguanidine, which increase the ratio of gaseous products and nearly eliminates the solid products. It's the expansion of gaseous products that actually propels the bullet, where it's the solid products that generate smoke and gum up firing mechanisms and clog gun barrels. So in general, propellants are more stable than igniter compounds and are designed to generate more consistent, reliable pressure from gas expansion, whereas igniter compounds are far more volatile and are designed to rapidly generate higher concentrations of heat.
Doc, we had one question, sorry, back on your statistics. For the increase in gun deaths in the Portland metro area, how many of those is that all crimes, or how many of those are possibly self-inflicted?
So the data depicted is all gun violence, and it did not, the data registry as it exists in the Portland Police Department doesn't differentiate between the two. At least from in the data that they've made available to us. So I was not able to distinguish self-inflicted from kind of assaults on the Portland level, but that very first screen you saw, it was able to, there was a clear distinction between what was self-inflicted and what was related to assault on others.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, if you don't mind, please keep calling my attention. I'm kind of jockeying between two screens as it is, so it's kind of hard to follow the chat thread as well. So don't hesitate to interrupt.
Will do.
So this here, bullets are typically because of its physical properties. Relative to other metals, lead is dense but soft. It's malleable at lower temperatures, and once molded into the casings, it doesn't significantly contract when it cools. So this allows for consistent, reliable manufacturing. A bullet's jacket is designed to compensate for some of lead's shortcomings. So the combustion of the propellant generates pressures and temperatures that can distort a lead bullet, leading to inconsistent performance when flying through the air. This also results in significantly diminished precision of the weapon and can lead to excessive wear and debris within a gun's barrel. So the jacketing of the bullet is a harder metal, most commonly a copper zinc alloy called gilding metal, which prevents bullet deformation or fragmentation prior to leaving the barrel. This leads to a more consistent projection, and it reduces kind of the wear and tear on the gun barrel. So bullet casings are often made of brass because they're corrosion resistant and they're able to withstand high pressure without deforming. And it's the ability to resist fracture and rupture that make it more reliable when the gun is trying to actually eject the casing from the chamber to make room for the next round. So if any of you are CSI fans like my wife is, you know that gunshot residue kind of coats every square inch of the Earth's exposed surfaces. But these residues are kind of comprised of a number of things, including unignited primer compounds, incompletely burned propellants, gun lubricating solutions, and residues from ammunition cartridges. Gun characteristics that influence wounding potential include its bore, its rifling, its barrel length, all of which influence the ammunition type and caliber a gun can effectively shoot. In addition to these factors, combine to influence muzzle velocity, which, though among the most influential physical properties in ballistics, is not the only factor that influences the interaction of a bullet with its target. It is common to discuss gunshot wounds as either high velocity or low velocity, with high velocity often kind of being used to represent rifle injuries and low velocity pertaining more to handguns. But this shorthand, I think, is the product of a kind of a willful ignorance regarding the actual pathophysiology of gunshot wounds that I hope to overcome today. So as a bullet passes through air at tremendous speed, it encounters significant resistance. So it makes its path of travel kind of inherently unstable. A bullet's natural inclination is to align its center of pressure above its center of gravity, which would actually cause an unstable flight path. However, the flight path can be stabilized significantly by spinning the bullet around its long axis. So this works the same as a football, kind of where a tightly spiraled pass will travel more efficiently through the air along a more consistent and reliable path compared to what we would describe as a duck pass or something like that. To impart this spin on a bullet, modern weapons, from all modern weapons, whether they're pistols or rifles or even anti-aircraft guns mounted on warships, employ a series of precise grooves within the gun's barrel called rifling. So this is what's known as the Greenhill formula, and it's used to calculate the minimum rifling twist rate for a specific round of ammunition. So the minimum rifling is actually specific to the bullet or the munition that's being used, but the rifling itself is characteristic of the gun, or more specifically the gun barrel. So gun manufacturers, when they design guns to achieve optimal spin rates, they do it for a range of ammunition that they expect to be fired by a particular weapon. So if you have too high of a twist rate, that can cause accelerated barrel wear, and the high velocities can actually lead to an increased risk of rupturing of the bullet's jacket. So the high velocity spin stabilized projectiles would kind of have a risk of sort of disintegrating in flight if they're spinning too fast. A higher twist than needed can also cause more subtle problems with accuracy. So if there's any kind of inconsistency within the construction of the bullet, such as a void or an asymmetric distribution of its weight, that can cause those kind of inaccuracies that led to by imprecise construction are magnified by higher spins. So the weapon depicted here is an AR-15 carbine, which is the civilian rendition of an M4 assault rifle that's fielded in the military. The M4 is kind of the standard bearing rifle that replaced the M16 and is now the most commonly carried rifle in the US military. It fires a 5.56 millimeter round of ammunition and thrusts it down a barrel with a 1 in 7 twist rate, meaning that a bullet will complete one full rotation for every 7 inches of travel.
One of the questions we had in there is, what are the detrimental properties of steel versus the brass casings?
Steel versus brass casings, or versus, are we talking casings or jackets?
The question was casings.
So the steel is actually one of the things, I don't know if there's a lot of recreational shooters out there, but in the military, particularly when we're firing weapons, the the worst part of the day is as the day wears on and the guns get hotter and dirtier and you start accumulating carbon and things like that, what happens is you get less reliable ejection of that cartridge. So as I mentioned, kind of the advantages of brass is brass kind of relatively holds its shape, right? For something that is containing an explosion, it holds its shape pretty well so that it can reliably be ejected from whether it's the rifle or the pistol. Steel doesn't do it quite as well as brass does, meaning that it's more prone to becoming deformed, and the less consistent its performance is when kind of trying to contain that explosion, the more likely it's going to get caught in your firing mechanism and not be ejected properly. So a semi-automatic or automatic weapon will automatically eject the prior casing and reload and load the next round. So if you have a less reliable ejection of the prior casing, it's gonna slow down your firing rate and things like that. So brass has been shown to be more reliable than steel in terms of being able to be ejected consistently. So as another example, this here is an AK-47. It's actually the most commonly manufactured in Russia. So this has kind of been the chosen weapon for many of our enemies in the last half century or more. The rifle is known to be more reliable in harsher conditions, but also less accurate than the American counterpart, which was the M16. The AK-47 fires a 7.62 millimeter round of ammunition down a 1 in 9.45 inch rifle barrel. So the bullet completes a rotation roughly every 9.5 inches of travel. In contrast, this is a 9mm Luger pistol, which uses a bullet with a much larger diameter but a shorter length and fired at a far lower velocity. So the barrel in a pistol has a 1 in 10 inch twist rate. So when you combine twist rates with muzzle velocities, this results in bullets with very tight spirals rotating at exceptionally high speeds. So in the case of the M4 previously discussed, the bullet rotates at a rate of 314,000 revolutions per minute, compared to roughly 252,000 RPMs for the civilian equivalent, the AR-15. That's more than 5,200 rotations per second. So higher spin rates are the result of a higher velocity, but also result in greater accuracy and consistency of flight path at the expense of stress on the projectile. So a 9mm pistol, by comparison, with its slower, stockier bullet, rotates 56,000 RPMs, or roughly between 1/5 or 1/6 as quickly as a bullet fired by an assault rifle. Just as a description, kind of published muzzle velocities for ammunition are typically measured using a 24-inch test barrel. So as a general rule of thumb, for every inch of barrel length below 24 inches, the muzzle velocity of a specific round decreases by roughly 20 feet per second. And for every inch greater than 24 inches, it increases by 24 feet per second. So as the bullet is traveling down the barrel, it's actually accelerating because the barrel protects it from the resistance of kind of air. And once it leaves the barrel and starts encountering that resistance, that's when the bullet can actually start, slowing down over space and time. So people commonly refer to gunshot wounds, as I mentioned earlier, as high velocity or low velocity based on the suspected weapon utilized. But larger handguns, such as a 357 Magnum or 44 Magnum, can actually achieve higher velocities than some of the smaller rifles, such as a Remington 22. So when I think of speed of a bullet, my mind just sort of reflexively thinks is like speed as being an indication of depth of penetration, as if the bullet were an arrow kind of being fired by a high-powered bow. It's also how we sometimes look at the depth of intrusion of the front end of a car as an expression of that car's speed at the time of impact. It's kind of like an intellectual shorthand for an imperfect understanding of physics. As I mentioned earlier, I think focusing solely on velocity is an oversimplification of understanding kind of wounding capacity of bullets and firearms. What's actually more important than muzzle velocity is impact velocity. It's a greater determinant of wounding potential. So bullets can be slowed or stopped by incidental obstacles or by ballistic armors, but if velocity were all that influenced the wounding potential, there would be no role really for bulletproof vests, right? Most ballistic armor doesn't protect its wearer by purely resisting penetration, but more so by actually distributing the force of impact across a greater area rather than leaving it concentrated on at the tip of a bullet. So in the case of what's called a contact shot, that's when a muzzle of a gun is pressed against a target. The impact is particularly devastating for two reasons. The first is that the bullet itself is still accelerating as it travels. So it leaves because it's accelerating, it's leaving in its wake kind of a negative pressure vacuum that pulls whatever is behind it into the wound channel. So a lot of that debris that you see kind of in the entry wounds of bullets and things like that, it's common. We might typically think that was sort of pushed into the wound by the bullet, but the reality is it's actually pulled into the wound by the negative pressure vacuum that trails the bullet. In the case of contact wounds, what's behind it is actually the undissipated, rapidly expanding gases that were expelled by the rapid burning of the propellant. So the tissues beneath the contact wound are exposed not only to the bullet traveling at its highest velocity, but also the force and heat of the exploding gases ignited by the primer being pulled into that wound channel. So forensically, the contact wound depicted here actually illustrates both the closely concentrated soot and debris expelled from the barrel behind the bullet, as well as kind of a circular contact burn from the interaction of the epidermis of the patient with the rapidly heated barrel of a fired weapon. Everybody loves physics, right? So reality is that I think it's more useful to think of gunshot wounds as high energy or low energy. Such terminology naturally focuses one's attention on wounding capacity, triggering thoughts of energy transfer from the projectile to the target, separating gunshot wounds from other forms of penetrating trauma. So while velocity is admittedly the principal component of a projectile's kinetic energy, the projectile's weight is also a factor. The potential energy of the primer and powder is transferred to the bullet when the primer is struck. So the energy of the bullet as it travels through the air is transferred to the target when it is struck. So all of this really is about energy transfer. So again, energy is transferred from primer to propellant, propellant to bullet, and then bullet to target. It's really the efficiency of the transfer from the bullet to the target that is the essence of terminal ballistics. And it's the behavior of the bullet after it strikes the target, but also the behavior of the target as the bullet strikes it. So this interaction is ultimately what defines a bullet's wounding capacity, dictating what kind of medical response is necessary to mitigate the harm generated. So again, just to summarize, terminal ballistics is a product of the properties of the projectile and the properties of the target, and it's really this interaction that results in wounding capacity. So to understand kind of the implications of gunshot wounds, I think it's important to understand at least the terminology that's used. So the term prompt damage is used to describe the tissue injury caused by the blunt force of a bullet against the tissue, plus the pressure created in the immediate area around this interface. So the permanent wound channel, which is often called like the bullet tract, is actually just the collection of prompt damage. So, prompt damage accumulates along the tract, resulting, in a what's called the permanent wound channel. So temporary cavitation is actually the product of radial acceleration of the surrounding tissue as energy is passed from the projectile to the material that passes through. So I don't know, I sometimes think of the picture, everybody's seen that like really fat guy in black and white when he gets like shot with a cannonball on the stomach, and you see the rippling effects of it, of the fat of his stomach when the cannonball hits it. So that's sort of like your temporary cavitation. It's that rippling of the tissue around the point of impact. Where some additional damage outside of the bullet tract actually can occur, and sometimes that is the far more devastating portion of the injury. So this illustrates kind of two key concepts, I think. One is that the bullet behaves differently once it has struck its target than it did when it was passing only through air, and two, that the damage generated from the bullet is not limited to the bullet tract, right? A bullet is not just a deep stab wound. So one of the more significant properties of a projectile in terms of its wounding capacity is its jacketing, as we described earlier. So this has been the subject of extensive debate in international community regarding the humane conduct of war. So a fully metal jacketed bullet with the projectile is stabilized in its flight by the spiraling induced by a gun's barrel rifle. And then when it strikes the target, that bullet ceases to spin and its path becomes unstable. So lacking the spin, the bullet's center of pressure will then be inclined to rotate over its center of gravity. So this causes a bullet to actually flip on its axis and then proceed along the rest of its path kind of ass first until all of its kinetic energy is dissipated. So this is one of those ballistic gels, and a bullet was fired from the right side to the left side of the screen. So what you can see, this was a highly elastic gel where the bullet entered the gel, flipped on its axis, resulting in a widened permanent wound channel. But then it continued along its path with the rear of the bullet facing forward, and the permanent wound channel returned to kind of that narrower cross-sectional area of the bullet itself. So it goes from narrow to wide during that tumble and then back to narrow again. So this again is a fully metal jacketed round of ammunition. So the nature of a full metal jacket is that once it strikes that tissue, it immediately becomes unstable, but it will still travel a certain distance that's based on the target's elasticity before it actually begins to tumble. Therefore, gunshot wounds that go through narrow bands of tissue such as extremities may never begin to tumble. For other targets, the bullet may exit the body in the midst of its tumble, resulting in an exit wound that is closer to the bullet's long axis profile rather than its short axis profile. So a much larger exit wound if it exits mid-tumble than an entry wound. Really thick bands of tissue, however, may result in complete tumble and an exit wound that again more closely resembles the short axis kind of cross-sectional area of the bullet. So in such cases, an exit wound can actually be deceptively small and fail to indicate the true volume of the permanent wound channel underneath. So this is also why it can sometimes be difficult to distinguish entrance and exit wounds, as they both may have similar cross-sectional areas if the bullet completed its tumble internally. So in this video, a NATO 5.56 fully jacketed round penetrates the gel. It travels a certain distance before it begins its tumble, and then it transfers a larger quantity of energy in the form of a temporary wound cavity. The transfer is augmented as the bullet goes through its tumble, distorting its linear path. So again, when the bullet is traveling head on, it's dissipating its energy less than as the bullet starts to tumble and now is traveling along its long axis. So it's a broader surface area, so therefore more energy is going to be transferred, and that's why that wound, that temporary wound cavity actually kind of goes from small to much larger. It then completes its tumble, and then the temporary wound cavity starts to get smaller again. Once the bullet has completed that tumble, less energy is transferred, and the bullet exits the gel backwards. So this is a phenomenon known as overpenetration. So the bullet still remains able to do damage, although it's carrying considerably less kinetic energy than it was first fired. But the pass-through of a fully metal jacketed bullet increases the risk of injury or damage to intentional or unintentional background targets. So here's an illustration of the performance of the performance of a fully metal jacketed bullet, which you can see in the top left after it's been fired into a target, compared to a variety of partial jacketed hollow point bullets. So you can see the exposed lead at the tip of partial jacketed bullets facilitates the deformation of these bullets into projectiles with larger cross-sectional surface areas. So this larger area means that the prompt damage will be a cross-sectional area greater than the original kind of cross-sectional area of the bullet. However, hollow point bullets also don't tumble. So the total volume of the permanent wound channel may actually be less with a hollow point bullet than with a fully metal jacketed round. But again, this is specific to the permanent wound channel, specific to the bullet tract, which, as we've mentioned, is barely the tip of the iceberg when we talk about the total wounding capacity. So this video illustrates it's a different, the gel is of different elasticity. But you can see an expanding bullet is designed to begin to distribute its energy immediately upon penetration, resulting in a massive temporary wound cavity just below the surface. In fact, the bullet transfers its energy so efficiently, it doesn't penetrate the backside of the gel. So hollow point bullets therefore inflict tremendous damage on the first target they strike and are less of a threat to background targets because they are much less likely to overpenetrate. So think of the expansion of a hollow point bullet as like the deployment of a parachute in which a larger cross-sectional area facilitates the rapid deceleration of the bullet once it struck its target. This deceleration, however, results in far greater and far more efficient transfer of energy from the bullet to the target. And this is essential to understanding gunshot wounds. The mechanism of injury in a gunshot wound is far greater than simply the permanent wound channel or bullet tract, as the tissue around the tract ends up absorbing extraordinary amounts of energy. And it's this energy combined with the tissue's fragility, elasticity, and plasticity that ultimately determine the severity of the injury. So interestingly, those of you without a significant background in firearms, knowing what you know, which of these two types of ammunitions do you think is more suitable for combat, which is more suitable for law enforcement, and which would be more suitable for recreational hunting? So it's actually, to me, it was counterintuitive, right? But it's actually the Geneva Conventions dictate that in the laws of war that only fully metal jacketed bullets should be used in conflicts because they felt that partial jacketed or hollow point bullets inflicted far too much damage on their target. So the idea was that your idea is you want to incapacitate the enemy soldier, not necessarily just inflict massive amounts of damage. Whereas in both law enforcement and hunting, it's actually hollow point or partial jacketed ammunition that are considered to be the standard. In law enforcement, the main reason is that risk of over penetration, right? So if you're firing a gun at a criminal or something like that, what's in the background is obviously of paramount concern to you. So you want a bullet that, if you hit your target, you want it to stop with the target and not over penetrate. In hunting, it's sort of, you're hunting because your intention is to kill the animal, not incapacitate it. So you actually want a more efficient transfer of energy. You want that kind of higher likelihood of kind of a mortal wound. It's considered more humane to kill the animal quickly, right? So for both law enforcement and recreational hunting, it's partial jacketed hollow points that are preferred, whereas the laws of war dictate really that fully metal jacketed ammunition is the only round of ammunition that should be used in warfare. So this kind of, this was the Declaration of The Hague from 1899. This treaty had long been accepted as the standard bearer for combat, and even in 1998, a century after it was first written, it was adopted by the Rome Statute that served as the founding document for the International Criminal Court, a treaty that's supported by more than 120 countries in the world. Incidentally, there's 7 countries that did not ratify this treaty: Iraq, who at the time was under Saddam Hussein; Israel; Libya, who at the time was under Omar Gaddafi; China, Qatar, Yemen, and the United States. The Hague Conference initially took up this question over a specific concern in the medical community that the damage wrought by bullets with lead exposed at their tips caused just way too much damage. They were inhumane. So these bullets were actually, at the time, being used by the British military. So the British delegation conceded that the nature of the wounding pattern for partial jacketed ammunition, but argued that there's a difference in war between civilized nation and war against savages, was how the British kind of defended their use of this type of ammunition. So these bullets were actually called dum-dum bullets and named after the city in India where they were manufactured. So the British felt that dum-dum bullets were justified against savages who, although run through 2 or 3 times, do not seize their advance. I don't know, kind of just, seemed interesting and counterintuitive kind of historical connotation to the use of bullets and the nature of warfare. Over more than a century, this was kind of the standard. So here's an illustration of the wounding capacity of a fully jacketed round of ammunition traversing a target of uniform elasticity. So you can see the smaller 7.62 round is typically fired by a higher powered machine gun, resulting in a kinetic energy that is more than 6 times the rounds of a larger diameter 9mm kind of ammunition. So in the 1990s, U.S. Special Operations began to field hollow point ammunition after arguing that the 7.62 hollow point bullets and the Winchester 45 jacketed hollow point were not designed to cause unnecessary suffering. So given their unique mission set, more akin to law enforcement and force protection than conventional warfare, Special Operations began fielding partial jacketed hollow point ammunition in the 1990s, contrary to kind of the Hague Convention, because they felt they were complying with the spirit, both with the spirit of the law, but also that the nature of warfare in the modern world and their specific mission set was different than had been experienced previously. An incredible article that was written by two officials of the International Committee of the Red Cross. One was a physician, the other was a physicist. They wrote, quote, prohibited bullets are perceived as causing large wounds only because they tend to expand, so depositing their kinetic energy earlier in the wound track than fully metal jacketed bullets. Full metal jacketed bullets remain stable in their passage through tissues for a variable distance before turning side on. This deeper penetration means they may pass through the victim's body without causing as much tissue damage. The technical explanation for this difference in behavior of the two bullets is that when lead is exposed at the tip of the bullet splays open on impact with the tissue, increasing the presenting surface area of the bullet as it travels down track in the wound. This splaying open happens within a few centimeters of entry and results from the softness of the lead. In brief, bullet construction is only one of the factors which lead to large wounds. This understanding was the basis of a Swiss proposal that the legality of a bullet should be determined based on its pattern of energy deposition and not necessarily its construction. So with the fielding of a new pistol for the conventional military for the first time since 1985, the Sig Sauer M17 replaced the Beretta M9 and brings with it two different types of ammunition designed for different purposes. The U.S. military's adoption of hollow point bullets does not reflect a stubborn refusal to comply with international law so much as it reflects a greater interest in complying with the spirit of that law in a new environment of warfare that can no longer be described as conventional. So in modern wars, urban warfare, where combatants intermingle with the general population, is kind of the new norm, and over-penetration and background damage is less acceptable than in previously organized battlefields. To me, it's almost an injustice that stab wounds and gunshot wounds are commonly grouped under a heading of penetrating trauma as if the two should be treated similarly. Stab wounds correspond specifically to a wound track, essentially the permanent wound cavity. It is wound characterized almost exclusively by the accumulation of prompt damage limited specifically to the depth of a knife's penetration into the body. Gunshot wounds, rather, are wounds characterized by the transfer of an immensely concentrated focus of energy to our body's tissues, and some tissues are more resilient than others to transfers of such energy. So tissue resilience is a product of those factors I mentioned a few slides ago: elasticity, fragility, and plasticity. So tissue elasticity describes how well an organ absorbs and dissipates the energy transmitted to it from a projectile. Fragility relates to how sensitive the tissue's function is to the injury caused by that transfer. And then plasticity deals with the tissue's ability to heal and kind of regain its original functional performance. So as this chart illustrates, kind of brain tissue is remarkably elastic, meaning it can dissipate energy very efficiently. However, brain is quite fragile, and its plasticity is limited primarily to the contralateral hemisphere's ability to learn the function of the injured hemisphere. So this is why transcranial gunshot wounds are so devastating. It compromises the brain's plasticity, which combined with the fragility of the brain tissue leads to an injured organ that, even despite its high elasticity, still has extremely poor resilience relative to brain injuries that are only isohemispheric. So beyond simply a tissue's natural ability to accommodate transfers of concentrated energy, various disease processes also alter a tissue's elasticity. So you can see here fibroproliferative lung disease such as COPD, hepatic fibrosis or cirrhosis, or atherosclerotic vascular disease can compromise a tissue's elasticity, making the transfer of energy from a projectile far more devastating and an organ far less resilient. I often say that the actual injury is only a single factor in determining the patient's outcome, but rather the physiological condition they were in when they sustained their injury, as well as their psychosocial resilience that will ultimately determine the level of function they will regain and the speed with which they will regain it. So this is especially true in gunshot wounds, which to me are among the most devastating injuries our patient suffers. So contrary to what is popularly depicted in movies, stabilizing the patient almost never has to do with successful retrieval of the bullet. In fact, most retained bullets and bullet fragments are left in place in order to avoid the additional damage and blood loss that would be associated with retrieval. And they're almost never reachable through the bullet wound itself, which is what you normally see, I think, in movies. That said, bullets that are palpable under the skin and those that communicate with joints are typically removed. So bullets under the skin cause local irritation, so it's actually, and they can sometimes lead to erosion of the skin and things like that, and kind of chronic wounds and infections, as opposed to bullets in joints can actually lead not only to crippling arthritis, but also to long-term lead poisoning, because in which the synovial fluid that lubricates our joints slowly leaches the lead from the bullet, allowing it to then be absorbed into the bloodstream. There is no other fluid or tissue in the body that interacts with retains bullets in a way that can lead to systemic lead accumulation, just synovial fluid in joints. One of the reasons we may consider removing retained bullets is in patients for whom MRIs would have considerably influenced their treatment. And even still, most bullets, whether fully or partially jacketed, are MRI compliant. So in discussing the composition of projectiles earlier, you may recall that the majority of bullets consist of a lead core and a jacket that usually consists of a copper zinc alloy called gilding metal. Both of these materials are actually not ferromagnetic and therefore safe within the MRI. Steel, on the other hand, is an alloy of iron and carbon and is ferromagnetic. So somebody was asking about steel. So steel is sometimes used in casings, but sometimes it's also used in jacketing. So steel jacketed bullets or steel pellets from shotgun or air rifle injuries are not MRI compliant. So steel bullet jackets can often begin to fragment immediately upon penetrating a target. So any gunshot wound in which metallic debris appears within the permanent wound channel before that bullet has struck a hard object such as a bone or an external ballistic vest or something, those are characteristics of steel jacketed and therefore non-MRI compatible fragments. So I've seen a number of instances where ejected casings actually become embedded in either the shooter or a nearby bystander. And brass is, being the commonly used for casing, is an alloy of copper, zinc, and tin, and is not ferromagnetic. So the casings, if they become impaled, actually can safely be used in an MRI or put in an MRI. So when we discussed earlier the definition of the word ballistic, we failed to discuss kind of the second definition, specifically that it is a characteristic of an object controlled by no force other than gravity. So I think we've all probably heard the term going ballistic, but it was actually first coined in 1966 to describe the performance of guided surface-to-air missiles manufactured by the Soviet Union and used by the Vietnamese against American aircraft. So when the launch of such a missile was detected, the aircraft engaged in a series of evasive maneuvers which would demand the missile to perform beyond its guidance threshold. So by exceeding this threshold, the guidance systems would in effect become disabled and the missile would quote unquote go ballistic, meaning it was no longer responsive to guidance input. So ballistics then is the study of bullets and firearms. It's the study of things that are beyond our control, and anything that is controllable about a bullet is lost the instant the trigger is pulled. I do want to thank Dr. Jerry Jerkovich, who co-authored a book chapter with me that included a lot of the analysis contained in this presentation. And I really want to thank all you guys for your efforts in caring for the victims of this pandemic of gun violence we are witnessing within the context of this larger, viral pandemic. So the psychosocial and physical impacts of which I think we're going to be dealing with for some time to come. So I'm happy to open it to any questions, comments, feedback. I'm always interested in how I can make my presentations better or more effective to another audience. So please be brutal.
So one of the questions is, are there any other metals that are used in bullet construction other than lead that cause toxicity issues?
I don't, to my knowledge, I don't know the answer to that specifically. None that I know of, none that I have seen kind of described in the ballistics literature, but I mean, lead is by far and away the most common one. So I'm not even sure where other bullets or of other compounds would be manufactured. So to my knowledge, no. But that doesn't mean you can't take a bullet and then lace it with something else like mercury or something else that could be toxic. You know, you've seen in movies or something where they tried to dip bullets into something that could conceivably be more toxic, almost like a poison-tipped arrow type situation. I don't know how those bullets would penetrate would perform in flight, but the bullet construction itself, there's no guidance I've been given in the military and none that I've seen in the literature that says, you know, that other bullets are potentially poisonous long term.
I think I know the answer to this question, but would knowledge of the bullet construction really for EMS alter wound care or treatment?
I don't think so. I don't think knowledge of the bullet construction would alter long-term treatment. I guess really honestly the point of this, of taking these last 50 minutes of your time, is really to kind of try to reframe that thought process that the injury is more than the bullet tract, right? It's really about the transfer of energy. And I think a lot of times when we see a through and through injury, as opposed to an injury without an exit, we almost think the through and through is a worse injury because like it still had enough energy to actually pass through the backside, right? So it must have been a higher velocity, right? That's kind of the shorthand our brain tends to use. Whereas, you know, what I would say is that I'm probably more concerned about the bullets that don't come out the other side. I don't think they were traveling slower. I think they were more efficient at dissipating energy and transferring that energy to the target. So, honestly, a lot of this other kind of background information was really intended to kind of support and then reinforce kind of that idea that it's all about energy transfer, and what you're seeing on the surface is really just the tip of the iceberg of what's going on inside. So I don't think it would necessarily change your wound management, but it may change or influence things like your resuscitation strategy. Thinking that like, an entry wound only located in the right area over a liver, you're gonna think higher levels of liver damage, therefore more likely needing resuscitation and things like that, and IV support and sort of things. Same thing with passage in the chest. Potentially considering, intubation earlier or something along those lines, just by thinking of it more as the transfer of a large amount of energy rather than just a bullet tract like it's an extra long knife wound or stab wound or something.
And this might go along into that. Some agencies, maybe not all, it's kind of a new treatment form, especially at the BLS level, of being more immediate with wound packing. You want to talk about that versus just straight on tourniquet? What one better than the other, especially for bullet wounds?
Yeah, I think the Stop the Bleed kind of campaign and things like that. You are trying kind of wound packing and directed pressure, and the main reason is that a tourniquet obviously compromises circulation to all of the tissue distal to that tourniquet as opposed to just that area immediately around that wound. So if you can control bleeding with packing and direct pressure, that's always going to be preferable because it's going to limit the amount of ischemic damage that's done to the remainder of that that extremity. Just like I sort of said, you know, like it's hard, you're not rarely going to be able to extract the bullet through the original entry, but still kind of treating your entry and exit wounds with directed pressure and a wrap. If you can control bleeding with that and allow the rest of the extremity to be perfused, that's probably to the patient's advantage for a number of reasons, especially if there's going to be a long transport. You know, if you're relatively remote, or you're going to a critical access hospital that is then going to try to transfer that patient to a, you know, a trauma center or something like that, the longer that tourniquet is up, the more ischemic damage and metabolic consequences are developing. So you sort of want to do the least amount to control the bleeding as possible. But that said, you know, what lies under the surface is going to tell the real story. In terms of how much blood loss is actually occurring and how much, you know, tissue damage has actually been done.
All right, Doc, and there, I don't know if you can pull up the questions and take a look at those. There's some more just comments in there for you than questions you can look at as you have time. Any other questions for the doc before we move on and go to your lunch break? All right. Well, I think that is it. Oh, unclear about the last point. I think the last point I don't want to like kind of clear that up, but direct pressure I think is where the doc was getting on. Like wound packing, right? Is what you're saying. It'd be a more immediate control of the bleed would be a better method than just playing on a tourniquet and forgetting about it. Was that kind of your point at the end? Was if you can, wound packing would be a better treatment than just a straightforward tourniquet?
Yeah,
possible.
so not so much better, but I think it, like everything else, it's sort of stepwise, right? Like everybody that has slightly low oxygen doesn't get intubated. You try like supplemental oxygen first, and you try increasing incremental. So I think what I'd say is I would try to start with kind of the directed pressure and wound packing, and you know, if that succeeds, great, kind of you're done. But if only once that has failed would I then kind of proceed on to tourniquet. And you know, that's an assessment that's done in, you know, in less than a minute. You know, you've tried your packing, it's bleeding through. Okay, now I'm going to apply my tourniquet. So I don't think you're necessarily losing that much by just going through things kind of stepwise and sequentially, rather than just jumping straight to the tourniquet, which is what I think, you know, you'll sometimes see in less trained or less experienced people, which, you know, through no fault of their own, it's just that lack of experience. Whereas I think the professionals, we go through it a little bit more methodically and try to do the least damaging interventions first. And only once we're certain that those aren't going to work, then absolutely I would, you know, proceed to tourniquets. Tourniquets are absolutely life-saving.
This question might be a little more A and P deep for you. Do you know what is the property in synovial fluid that makes it more advantageous to transfer the lead poisoning in that versus other fluids?
You know, I do not know the biochemical reason for it. I'll be honest, I don't know, other than that's the guidance or specific or physiology behind it. I'll look that up for next time though.
All right, any other? So here's a question. What's your opinion of hemostatic wound packing in the abdominal area? Originally it was strictly a no-no, but now I'm reading that it's a changing. So wound packing in the EMS setting in the abdomen or the chest. What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, overall, I'm pro, you know, because I think if somebody's got a penetrating abdominal wound, they're going to surgery, right? So I don't think you necessarily need to worry about like trying to, you know, pack, you know, that you're going to lose your packing or something like that. That patient's going to get explored like some, you know, probably 100% of the time. So if there's anything you can do to try to control bleeding, it's probably better. Now, the truth is that it's probably going to be of limited success kind of in the anterior abdomen, you know, kind of where you have the abdominal cavity that's much more open, there's more space, you know, you're not going to really be able to fill that. fill that cavity, but especially around the flanks and in the back, in the, toward the area that we call the retroperitoneum. That area is much more contained, so like kidney injuries, retroperitoneal kind of liver injuries, those sorts of things. I think packing is much more likely to be effective because that's a tighter kind of cavity as opposed to kind of the anterior abdominal cavity that has our bowel and everything in it. So either way, it's probably okay to try to achieve hemostasis. I think it's going to be far less successful in the anterior abdomen than along the flanks and kind of in the back.
Okay. Well, with that, we will thank you, and we will move on to our lunch. We will meet you guys back here in roughly 50 minutes, 45 minutes.
All right, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your conference.